one thing that I do, and I've done for years, like throughout my work, is I've basically created a whole series of characters, basically just to explore various parts of my own my own body, my own identity, and my own relationship to the world around me.
Hello, my name is Eline Perez and you're listening to Are You an Artist? And today's artist is Abigail Jacqueline Jones, who generously shares with us her experience, how she explores the body, identity, and the world through art. She also speaks about kinkiness and having no filter. This episode is extremely interesting and rich in references, so if you are curious about anything you hear, have a look at the podcast notes. Enjoy! Well, hello, Abby. I think we're good to start.
At last.
At last, after all the setting up. Oh my god, that was a long one. And I'm gonna just start by reading out a letter I've written to you.
Okay.
Dear Abby, you're another star I met working at Wilton's Music Hall, and what really made me want to have you in this podcast is how passionate you are about your work. Your Instagram bio says live artist, storyteller, Rizo artist, I don't know how to pronounce it.
There are many schools of thought on that. So I pronounce it Rizo, but you'll hear people say Rizo and Rizzo. Like, there's many different ways of saying it.
Rizo then, and Sinister, which makes me wonder, what do you not do? You always have projects going on. During our Wilton's breaks, I can witness you learning a long text, or spitting passionately about your heroes, or painting signs to support your friends' next performances. What a crazy, inspiring life you seem to have. I also admire the commitment and clarity in your ideas and direction. So thank you so much for allowing me to interview you. And my first question is, are you an artist?
I mean, I think if I wasn't at this point, then if I wasn't able to describe myself as that at that point, then I'd probably have some very severe self-esteem issues, frankly. I am an artist. I am a researcher as well. And I dip my toes into performance every so often, trying to do so more and more, just trying to get my confidence up in that way. I'm speaking to you now, having just come off the back of doing my first hosting job as a cabaret host.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful
last
that
night,
you're happy to do this morning because
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I wanted to try and get a bit of a lie-in after this because it was probably my last big commitment of the year, what I did yesterday. But I kind of knew, again, living next to a building site, that wasn't going to happen. Like, I am woken up at 8 o'clock in the morning, regardless of what time I get to bed, which is usually sometime past midnight or 1 o'clock.
wow.
So thank you for having me on.
Well, that's so great. And I mean, because you have all these things, why are you still working at Wilton's?
Yeah, no, I mean it's been good. It's been good for kind of just flexibility in that way. To say something really boring about it, but like I feel like it's just such a wonderful and welcoming and creative environment just to be in. There's just so many just amazingly creative people that work in that space, and it's a space that kind of, I often say it's like a good place to kind of maladaptively daydream, working at Wilton's, just because it's a place where even in the midst of busy shift, it's very easy to kind of drift off in the whole sort of like history and like atmosphere of the place.
That's true.
Just being this just wonderfully rich, just ancient building with such a storied history and such a connection to such a connection to the local area, to the kind of very kind of backwater east end setting that it's in. I mean, I have found it a very rewarding space to be in, and it has also fed my work quite a lot. So one of the characters that I developed, which was based on the early life and the sort of teenage life of a 19th century female giant who was exhibited by P.T. Barnum during her lifetime, whose name was Anna Swan. I kind of came to that project by just realizing that the space I was in at Wilton's, this sort of very kind of very run down, almost like burnt out looking husk of this old Victorian house of entertainments, sort of reminded me a lot of P.T. Barnum's American Museum in downtown New York, or how I would imagine it would have looked after the fire that took it, that destroyed it in July of 1865, when the real life inspiration for my character, the real life Anna Swan, this female giant, would have been inside as a kind of, I think she was about 18 or 19 at the time, being exhibited. And I just kind of imagined just kind of standing in that space, sort of looking at these kind of worn out walls. I mean, the American Museum was this space of, it was about 4 or 5 stories of just these like this maze of like rooms and lounges and salons just filled with like so many different either human exhibits or animal exhibits or just curiosities from history that all surrounded this like giant like sort of theatre space, which was kind of euphemistically known as the lecture theatre. But it was predominantly used as a place for variety entertainment to be shown, which is very much it's very similar to the kind of setup that we have at Wilton's and how it would have been back in the days when it was actually an operating traditional music hall in the 19th century.
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought, like, just imagining that was just yeah, that's basically how how that project just spawned, was me just, like, standing behind the bar, just looking out at the empty alley behind us that was all kind of, like, lit with
Wow.
those lamps that kind of they're not gaslit, but they look like the old traditional gas lamps you would have seen in the Victorian era. I'm just thinking how just yeah, just imagining myself as this giant character sort of, like, living in the imagining what would have happened had she not actually kind of had she survived but not actually made it out of the fire and was just like living in the ruins of that building and trying to sort of piece everything back together.
Oh, wow.
So I mean, yeah, it's always been an inspirational space, and I think that's kind of why after like 4 years of working there, like out of everyone who works in that space, I've been working there a lot longer than pretty much everyone else. Like it's so hard to get out, you know. It's
Yes.
so hard to sort of like leave that space. And even though like for the sake of my creative career, I'm sort of having to think about moving on at this point. Like I don't want to leave it entirely because
But
it's but yeah,
just
it's
keep a foot there and
yeah, of
yeah.
course. Like I yeah, just be someone who drops in every so often, just like one of those parts of the furniture that's never truly gone. That just
I'll
is
be
just
still
like a bit
there.
of yeah, like a little bit of a sort of like wandering spirit, I guess, like someone who just like haunts every so often, like
Yes.
you know.
Wow. And if I go back to like your childhood, do you have a first creative memory, the very first creation that you did?
Oh God. So I mean, I've always been one for kind of like I've always had quite a strong sort of like storytelling bent about me. I've always been like quite a bit of a creative writer. I remember back when I was in primary school, I did like write a lot of like short stories and sort of short books that like often has sort of graphic components to them as well. So I remember, like, I used to be part of this gifted class at my old primary school where it was literally just like the top performing students from every year in the junior portion of the school, which would have been from year 3 up to year 6, so about sort of 7 up to 11. Um, and I remember I wrote like I wrote a really long adaptation of a an old comic strip from the late 1950s called The Black Sapper. I think it was a cartoon that appeared in the Sparky comic, if I remember rightly.
Oh,
It was one of
wow.
it was like an old school sort of British children's comic.
That's
Like
cool.
there's only like a few of I think the Beano might be the only one of them left now, but there used to be like tons of them. I mean, there was the Dandy when I was growing up, and like before my time, there used to be like comics like the Topper and the Beezer, like which I used to be able to read because the publisher who created all these comics, DC Thompson, used to um, put out this strip every month called Classics from the Comics,
Hmm.
which just ran strips all the way, as I say, going back to the 1950s all the way up to sort of the 90s, I guess, just before my time. Um, so and this story was all about this supervillain who kind of did his evil deeds by he built this sort of giant black tunneling machine that he'd just used to sort of tunnel around and sort of like access things like bank vaults and like I don't know, just things like that basically. So I remember writing an adaptation of that for that class. I also on the comic theme, when I was about I think 7 or 8 years old, I actually wrote like a solid 4 or 5 page story, which I'm pretty sure we still have somewhere knocking
Oh,
around.
wow. That'd be great to
Which
read it.
yeah, was based on a load of characters from the Beano, this comic I mentioned earlier that I was obsessed with all the way up through primary school. And I wrote it for a competition that was literally called Best Beano Fan Ever, which sadly I didn't win, but
Oh,
I came very close. Like they
that's
had like a
good.
winner's prize and like a series of runners up prizes, but like I remember getting a letter from them saying they were so impressed with the entry that they actually gave me like an additional prize on top of
Oh,
the runners up
nice.
prizes. So I was very happy with that, but like I also remember I wrote this one story that I remember being called Wolf Steam, and I remember absolutely fuck all about it. I just remember the name. It was something I came up with again when I was about 7, but I think I think after that, like I sort of took quite a bit of a break from sort of both fiction reading and writing when I was sort of in my late primary school, early secondary school years. I think a lot of that came down to the fact that I just had a really bad problem with skim reading books at the time. So
Oh.
I'd kind of just rush through everything and not really pick up anything from fiction. I kind of much preferred like reading kind of non-fiction or reading reference books. Like I had a lot of books about things like contemporary architecture and like the history of the London Underground, for example, which are like really exciting topics to be into as like an 11 or 12-year old. Um,
Mm.
I maybe at this point you could possibly tell I'm autistic and have special interests, but
But you're very
um,
interested in history, no?
yes,
Because.
yeah, and I kind of yeah, I think as I kind of returned to sort of creating fiction and storytelling when I was about 15, 16, like
Hmm.
I kind of started to build that back in a bit more. Like I started to build the kind of the I looked a lot at sort of like histories and also kind of geographies as well. Like I
Mm.
kind of became obsessed with just reimagining just spaces that I was familiar with or like little secrets that I kind of just I kind of knew about, but people are in the same landscapes may not have been able to sort of see or perceive quite so evidently. Um, so my first foray back into writing fiction or attempting to do so when I was about 15, um, I took part in this event called National Novel Writing Month, which we're recording this in November, is actually going on at the moment. And it's a challenge to write 50,000 words of a novel within the 30 days of November. And
Okay.
this was a challenge I completed when I was 15/16 because my birthday's in November as well. Um, and in my GCSE year, while I was studying for my GCSEs, um, and that's the story I wrote for that was a story called Brompton Road. And it was like a very classic kind of fantasy story about like a kid who finds like a secret portal into like another world. And the portal in question that I kind of invented was based off, well, the name Brompton Road actually comes from a a closed tube station on the Piccadilly line between Knightsbridge and South Kensington. It was closed in the 1920s, I think, because they were sort of planning to extend the line just to sort of like make the line run a bit faster, because there are a lot of stops on the Piccadilly line, and it's like they're very close together in central London, um, and the stations below ground and above ground still exist. Like it's still a functioning station. You can see like evidence of the platforms sort of being sealed off by this sort of random wall below ground, and there's another station close by. That also closed roughly at the same time, called Down Street, which actually features in a book by Neil Gaiman called Neverwhere. It's sort of where the big conclusion happens, where the sort of lead characters meet the main villain of that story, which is a little bit more evident. Like you'll just see as you're going between like Green Park and Hyde Park Corner, if you look out one side of the train, you'll see this like huge golden brick wall just
Oh,
coming out of the side of the tunnel. And like I just kind of imagine this idea of like this train just like somehow knowing to stop and let this little kid out and just go and just let them into this sort of fantasy world that lay behind these golden walls
that's
that just
crazy.
randomly pop up
Yes.
on the Piccadilly line, you know.
Mm-mm.
So like, but yeah, like, but from that point on, sort of like histories and geographies really like strongly featured in that work, and like really continue to do so like into the present day. Like
Mm.
even though I've kind of moved in more recent writing away from looking at my kind of direct environments, my direct histories, my direct geographies a bit more, and trying to explore some things that I'm not quite as sort of directly experienced with personally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, that's always been a running theme. Like
Yeah.
throughout my work is just like having this hyper fixation on just exploring and reimagining sort of real, particularly social histories and geographies surrounding me.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I mean, one like I'm just an aside, just to finish this point off. Like I'm always a bit of a stickler for geographical accuracy when it comes to books I read as well. Like I will always
Oh, you will
like
check it.
oh god, yeah.
Oh,
Like I
wow.
remember like I spoke to I spoke to a researcher a little while back, and as like I decided, because of the fact that and I'll come to talk about a bit more about this later. I had some arts council funding, and I had some like sort of monetary stipends I could pay my interviewees.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't take me up on it, so I decided just to send her like a goodie bag full of like just printed matter that I'd created over the course
Yes.
of the last few years. And one of the things I sent her was this hand-drawn map of central London that I created during the COVID-19 lockdowns.
Oh.
Um, and when she received this, she
So
told me
wait,
that
you drew a map of London?
yeah, I'll talk about it more in a
Oh,
second. But
wow.
like yeah, I sent her this map, and she told me that like she'd been reading this series of books called the PC Peter Grant series by an author called Ben Aronovich, which is basically a story series about a secret wing of London's Metropolitan Police that like uses magic and deals with the supernatural.
Mm.
And she was saying that she wanted to use the maps to try and like trace the locations where everything took place, because the one thing I appreciate about those books is they were intensely geographically accurate. You know, you could trace exactly where these characters had gone, and it was very easy to see where the sort of the buildings, the settings like of these stories all kind of fit together, and how they also kind of they also kind of focused a lot on kind of just forgotten about places in London. A lot of like sort of suburban areas are kind of discarded in like popular conceptions of London, without the art space. So I remember like there was a whole section, there was a whole chapter in one of these books about a group of vampires who lived in the kind of outer London suburb of Purley, which is just like completely in the middle of nowhere. It's like Purley is not a place that people think about unless you are directly from there.
That's so true.
Um, so yeah, I yeah, that's something I very much appreciate about other people's work. If they're able
Okay.
to build those sort of histories and geographies in really tight, and I can see they've done their research, and it's something that just penetrates everything I do, really.
Oh wow. And like when you create something new, what's the feeling driving it?
I mean, there's a bit of kind of necessity about it, really. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one thing that people I think I found this more with people who are kind of outside of art spaces or have maybe only ever kind of seen sort of fine art or visual art certainly through the lens of the very kind of commercialized kind of Mayfair gallery kind of spaces. They always kind of ask me like, well, first of all, the first thing they usually ask me is, do I paint or do I sculpt? And the answer to that is neither, frankly. Um, because apparently those are the only two art forms that exist
Do
to a
you
lot of
paint or do you
people.
sculpt?
Yeah, the two
Are
genders,
you an
paint or
artist?
sculpt. Yeah. But I mean, whenever people ask me about my influences, like the artists who influenced me that kind of got me into creating art or sort of writing or sort of performing in the first place, like the answer to that is like there weren't really that many. Like the idea of me having influences and heroes came on a lot later, and I mean, I could certainly list them, and as you said, I've spoken about sort of several of them as we've sort of been hanging out at work. Like I know I've just spent a lot of the last couple of months just chatting, just endlessly about Annie Sprinkle, the sex worker turned performance artist extraordinaire, you know. But um, I think for me, like art and writing, just creativity in general, just gave me the ability to say a lot of the things I wouldn't have been able to say, um, just literally, just as myself. Like I kind of one thing that I do and I've done for years, like throughout my work, is I've basically created a whole series of characters basically just to explore various parts of my own kind of my own body, my own identity, and my own relationship to the world around me. And this, I think there is something that kind of like links back to my experience with kind of neurodivergence, my experience of being an autistic person, of being someone who sort of struggles with a lot of social anxiety and kind of has a lot of just I don't know, like a lot of things that people would perceive to be kind of just wrong or kind of weird about them. I mean, certainly growing up, that I felt like I just needed an outlet for all of these things. And like quite often, I don't even realize that I'm sort of like getting as significant an insight into my own psyche as I actually am through creating work. And
Yeah.
like the greatest example I can think about for this is when I was in my final year of school and the kind of year or so like before I started university, um, I wrote a book that is probably rivals War and Peace for length. I'm not even joking about that. It's like into like I think before I stopped working on it, like the draft I had was like for one book was the equivalent of like two-thirds of the entire Harry Potter
Oh
series.
my
I'm
god.
not even joking. It was like in the 600 or 700,000 word kind of
Dear.
range. And it wasn't good. Like I'm just to straight up say that it was an absolutely trash piece of writing that I was just using as a way to like explore like just
Uh-huh.
elements
Wow.
of person.
That's interesting.
But no, the kind of the story was set within this like kind of it was set within a boarding school space, which kind of speaks a lot to like my experiences of having gone to like a very prestigious school growing up, which wasn't a boarding school, but it was of that kind of echelon. Like it was sort of one of those schools that's kind of up there with the Eatons and Harrows of the world. Um, and like it was set within this like boarding house that it was like a girls' boarding house, and like every one of the kind of side character girls was like they had like one kind of personality trait that was just everyone had like a personality trait that was so clearly drawn from just divisions of myself. So there was one person who had like this absolutely kind of photographic memory for maps and just like like a really intimate like sort of cab driver's knowledge of the streets of London. There was another one who was quite sporty and like was like a kind of this kind of prodigious player of like one very particular sport that I played growing up, which the name of which was Eton Fives. It's a very kind of private school thing. I'm not going to try and explain what it is now because that will take up quite a big chunk of the rest of this podcast. And there are a lot of the characters were like that. And then you also had these the two main girls who were sisters, one of whom was this absolute sort of workaholic, sort of study obsessed teenager who just like would sacrifice absolutely everything in her life for the pursuit of just an extra couple of percentage points on her grades and just try and get into the best university, try and get herself like the best possible job she could and set herself up for the future as best she could. And then the other one was just this kind of very like ridiculously imaginative, playful, kind of waif-like young girl who also happened to be like super tall, which I am as well. And also like I wrote in that she had like breasts that were so kind of like non-existently kind of transparent on her body that you could see her rib cage through it. And like I was basically describing what I thought I would look like had I been born a cis girl, you
Mm.
know. And like I also want to say that I stopped working on this book like the second I came out to myself as trans,
Mm.
like because it was so clearly like a piece of work that I was just doing to kind of like essentially psychoanalyze myself and kind of try and figure out these kind of what the hell my kind of body was, what the hell my kind of psychology was as someone who'd like grown up in like a very heavily masculine dominated environment. As someone who was an only child, someone who didn't really have that was it's kind of also like a weird middle child in my family as well. Like there's no one in my family that's within like a solid half decade of me in age, you know. And just like also went to all boys schools their entire life, just had like just and was also just like as I say, autistic and had like just very little sort of social or psychological connection to any of the people around me,
Yeah.
trying to figure out what that kind of was and what my kind of ideal childhood would have looked like,
Mm.
you know, and what my kind of ideal future might look like, kind of led me to that place. So like creativity's always been a way of exploring that for me. And like in my current project, which is kind of is all about my kind of I mean it's I mean, to put it simply, a lot of it is like kind of to do with how like sort of my kink has basically helped me kind of explore my relationship with my body and my relationship with gender and with the kind of socio-political world around me. Like it still all comes back to just like trying to figure out how I kind of relate to the world around me, how I kind of how I fit into this space and how I relate to that space and like just trying to just and also just trying to deal with the kind of like the anxieties that I feel about the world around me as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they're kind of and doing so in ways that feel like comfortable to me.
Yeah.
Um and
Not that
yeah.
someone tells you, do this.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, yeah, it's kind of, yeah, about making sense, no? Like,
Yeah, no, completely. Like
mm,
that's the entire purpose of it because I mean, I felt the world is a strange enough place as it is. Like it's a confusing enough place as it is, but to have gone through a significant portion of your life, like because like I I didn't really know what it meant to be trans at all until I was like almost in my 20s. Like I came out when I was about 19 and like I mean to me like growing up like trans issues were not talked about. Like, and like trans bodies weren't seen. Like, the most you'd ever see of like trans people in sort of media or culture or in educational spaces were like documentaries like The Pregnant Man, for example, which was on Channel 4 when I was about, I'm gonna say I was about 9 years old, maybe 10.
Okay.
And like, but even then, like as someone who like was kind of young at the time, didn't really like, that was just confusion to you. You see a title of a TV show called The Pregnant Man, and you see that advertised, you think like, how the hell does that work? You know, like you kind of think, just to sort of quote Kindergarten Cop for a second, like, boys have a penis and girls have a vagina. You know, that's how it works. You're trying to think like, how the fuck is this man squeezing that out of that? You know, but like, so I didn't really know what it meant to be trans. I had no language, no lexicon for that. And like, even though I was diagnosed autistic at about the age of 13, and it was like very obvious, like from early childhood, that I was autistic. Like, it's only been within the last 18 months I've really been able to, that I've really been able to properly explore what it means to be autistic, and what like, and explore a lot of elements of my diagnosis that I didn't even know were kind of factors of it, I guess. Um, and I kind of feel, I kind of feel a little bit bitter about the fact that just no one actually gave me the language or gave the information that I needed to explore these on sort of more normal terms, I guess. And I had to
Yeah.
try and piece everything together myself. And for me, creativity, like making art, making fiction, was just making stories as a way of me doing that when no one else would really give me that information, you know? And I'm sort of, I don't know. And on the one hand, I'm so glad there is so much more information out there just for like trans kids, for neurodivergent kids now. They
Mm-hmm.
don't have to go through that struggle of trying to just, of feeling wrong, you know, in just in life as they're going through, as they're going through school, as they're going through puberty, as they're going through everything, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and yeah, I'm so happy that's the case now, but also just, I mean, I am a little bit sad that I never got to explore these things on my own terms with like the language I so desperately needed. But like, at least that's the kind of silver lining that I got from it. Like, it's made me just so strong and so powerful an artist to have
Yes.
had that experience. And I know that, like, yeah, I mean, it's an unfortunate way to come about your kind of career, your calling, you know, but I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's my story.
Yeah, yeah, it's really. I mean, you are a really strong woman, and
Thank you.
thank you so much for sharing this, because yeah, and because you're learning a lot about yourself. How do you feel when it comes to creating with people?
Um,
Is this something you
yeah.
do or
Well,
want to
I
do?
think this really comes down to the differences that I've seen in sort of working within visual art spaces and working within theatrical spaces. Because like, my background, my sort of study background is in fine art, is in visual art. That's what I went to university for. I was a Goldsmith student for 3 years, studying BA Fine Art. Um, but it wasn't, and that was like, making fine art in a lot of cases is a very solitary process. Like, you do think of just like singular artists in singular studios sort of creating work, and like, of course collaborations do exist, but they tend to be like very kind of improvised and ad hoc, and like, I don't like, this probably isn't going to be everyone's experience, but they felt very kind of temporary to me. There wasn't any sort of like, it was I found it very hard to sort of develop any sort of close connections or close collaborations in that space. But after I put on a solo show about 2 years ago, which I actually won an award to get the opportunity to host. It was, there was like only a kind of like small to mid-size award. It was something given out by a group called the Barbican Arts Group Trust, who have like a series of studio and gallery spaces in Walthamstow. And yeah, I submitted a piece for their open exhibition, which happens at the end of every year, and they gave me the opportunity to host like a big solo show in their project space. And that process kind of burnt me really burnt me out because, I mean, not just because it was the middle of the pandemic, we were in lockdown at that time. I was unemployed at that time because obviously, like, I had my job in Wilton's, and that Wilton's is a theatre, it wasn't open at the time.
Mm.
Um, and the gallery kind of really didn't give me any support
Oh.
as a creative, and considering a lot of my support networks had broken down during the pandemic, I had sort of nothing and no one creating that piece, that body of work. Apart from one piece that I created for that show, which was a kind of 6 foot high, like Victorian style double skirt and crinoline cage, which I kind of used to portray the character I spoke about earlier, the 19th century female giant Anna Swan, which that was a piece I did get to make with a very close friend and a very close friend of mine and textile artist named Zoe Sanders, wonderful woman. Um, but like outside of that, it was just a very solitary process, and like it messed with my mind. I mean, I like working with people. I like working around people. I kind of need people to kind of keep me on the straight and narrow a lot of the
Uh-huh.
time with my own sort of creativity and my own kind of mental state to stop me kind of spiraling, I guess,
Maybe to
into just
ground
like,
you, yeah.
yeah, basically. But after that, like, I basically started like exploring like theatre space, like fringe theatre space, as a potential conduit for my work. Um, and I remember going to this networking event at the Yard Theatre in Hackney Wick, where I met this amazing, just astonishingly talented young comedian called Lorna Rose Treen, who, like, if you've not heard of her yet, you almost certainly will within the next year because she's been blowing the fuck up at the moment.
Oh,
Like she
wow.
won, like she sold out her Edinburgh run. She sold out Soho this year several times over. She won Joke of the Fringe this year. She became the first ever like double award winner at the Funny Women Awards. Like she's been on the BBC this year, like quite a lot. But we got to know each other, and after I went on this like massive rant about just on Instagram, my Instagram stories about how kind of how inaccessible and how kind of just closed off and how solitary a lot of the sort of visual art world was. She invited me to this speed networking event that she ran herself for kind of like theatre makers and comedians and just various people from the world kind of fringing off West End theatre. And I ended up meeting just first of all, I ended up meeting a load of amazing performers through that space. Just people that have been so supportive of my kind
Mm.
of my work, trying to sort of like edge into a more theatrical space. Just to drop another few names, like people like Frankie Thompson, who, for my mind, might be like the best British performance artist of my generation, and
Hmm.
um, like the kind of clown ventriloquist Lachlan Werner and his director Laurie Lux, who I've been working with this year to develop my own work. Um, and also my good friend Everly, who ran a theatre company called Hoo Ha House, which I kind of worked with as a way of trying to get myself like used to working with theatrical spaces, and working with them in particular over the following year throughout 2022. I got to see what kind of sort of dramaturgical and kind of theatrical rehearsal spaces kind of looked like, and how just wonderfully playful and collaborative they were, and how much closer the collaborative relationship seemed to be within theatrical spaces as compared to artistic ones. And I just thought, we as visual artists have so much to learn from that. And I think I really want to find ways of taking that sort of theatrical method of collaboration and long-term collaboration into every single avenue of my creative practice now. And this is something I've spoken about with a lot of other people who come from a more kind of like a more fine art background, who like a lot of whom have edged into the world of performance. There's like another performer I'm very close with, who was actually one of my tutors at Goldsmiths, a kind of very strange kind of like comedy, sort of absurdist comedy performer called Louise Ashcroft.
Oh, I'll
Like
check her
we're
out.
yeah, so like we've been talking a lot about sort of ways of trying to introduce or trying to sort of like cross pollinate a lot of like the best working methods that we've gathered from theatre spaces with the best that we've gathered from kind of artistic space, and trying to really blend them together into this perfect collaborative kind of like, I was going to say unstructured, which it kind of is, but like a very kind of deliberately unstructured way of working
Mm-hmm.
that just allows for just so many different kind of so many different kind of just absurdist or avant-garde possibilities,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So like yeah, I really value collaboration, even though like a lot of my work is still very kind of solo, I guess. I've like there are a lot of people who work within my projects that are like I have, and particularly over the last year as I've been working through um developing my new body of work, and having support from Arts Council England's Developing Your Creative Practice programme to do that. Like I've started working with a lot of people like performance mentors who, like as I mentioned, Laurie Lux earlier.
Yeah, yeah.
I've also started working with a burlesque performer that I first met at Wilton's, actually,
Oh,
Eda Sanguin, who was one of the performers at the Bowie Cabaret that we have every year.
oh.
Um, and I've started working with kind of academic supervisors, and I've now got all these connections in the United States who I've started working with. So like I'm like quite close with the researcher I mentioned earlier while I was talking about the Peter Grant series, is a woman called Catherine Gates, who's been just so useful at just plugging me into all these kind of research and performance spaces on the other side of the Atlantic to help develop my work. So like there's like I'm not in a space where I have like a sort of devoted collaborative partner in a way that a lot of my connections in theatre do. Like, for example, like my friend Frankie has their partner Liv, and like Lorna, the comedian I had earlier, like they work with another comedian a lot called John Oldfield. Like they all have their kind of like they're very close buddies in this world, where
Yeah, yeah.
I don't have that yet, but like I have really started to incorporate their way of working into just trying to just cultivate this space of collaborators for my work, and
Mm-hmm.
just try and build a community around my work. And I mean the work that I've been doing at the moment is so like has just been so fulfilling, both for me and for a lot of the peoples and communities I have worked with in
Mm-hmm.
that time.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. And what would you say is your strength as an artist and but also as a human being?
Uh, I mean, I think that a lot of it just comes down to kind of a lot of it is breadth of imagination, I guess, but a lot of it's also just I think part of it's also just a bit of a lack of filter as well. Like, because a lot of the work that I do, like particularly the work I'm doing at the moment, like is so heavily embedded in kink space. Like a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is sort of, so I'm going to preface this by saying, because obviously anyone who's like listening to this, we have not got any cameras set up. Like as I said earlier, I am a trans woman. I am also like extremely tall, like sort of
Oh
regardless of
yes,
gender.
she is.
Um, yeah, and like a lot of so like and a lot of my kind of exposure to kind of like the idea of like a woman who could be like my sort of size came from like heavily kind of either kind of like freak show television or like kind of very highly eroticized or fetishized media. So things like sort of Amazonian or sort of giantess fetish material. And a lot of the work that I've been trying to do at the moment has been just trying to kind of reclaim the kind of the identity of giantess and use that to tell a story about my own kind of my own coming out process and my own relationship with my body as a woman who is 6'7", um, and also just kind of also explore the kind of giantess body as something that could be like very kind of like rebelliously and kind of like erotic in a very queer way, in a very kind of just revolutionary way, I guess. Like using the whole kind like the ideas of kind of just this kind of destructively sublime body as like a sort of this this fantastical body with the potential just to kind of like eradicate every kind of like system of injustice in the world and sort of leave behind a space where like something that's genuinely kind of yeah like kind of queer and tender and post-capitalist, where like the ideas of like just like the gender binary just doesn't exist anymore, you
Mm.
know. And also kind of realizing that as much as I did kind of attach myself to like sort of imagery of like I mean like I kind of found a lot of the imagery that kind of inspired me to kind of come out and make me realize that I sort of could be taken, seriously as a woman, as someone who is this tall. Like also, as I say, came from just discovering them through kind of like just, as I say, freak show or fetish spaces, because that was the only place you could ever kind of see them, and um, just feeling so ashamed of this fact growing up, because like I kind of I'm gonna go on so many tangents to like explain this. It's like such a difficult thing to explain, but I often I often speak about this idea of the B versus do conundrum, which as I call it, like the idea that for a lot of queer and trans people growing up in a world like a very heterosexist world where um like the idea of like sort of gender identity and the things you should get sort of gender euphoria from, like have to be very just distinct and discrete and mutually exclusive from the things you're supposed to derive like kind of sexual attraction from. And how for queer people it can be very difficult to try and piece together like when you see a body that like you feel some sort of attraction to that doesn't line up with those heterosexist norms, like trying to think to yourself like do I kind of admire this person for their kind of for their look, their personality, their sense of style, etc.
Mhm.
um or do I kind of just want to fuck them, basically? And this is like a question that like, and like as like somebody growing up, and particularly somebody growing up assigned male as birth, like the inevitable answer to that question, particularly when you look at like any sort of feminine body, is going to be the latter. Like, because that's just the culture you've grown up with. So like when I came across a lot of these bodies, like particularly as someone who just was absolutely terrified of the idea of male sexuality, and sort of like was terrified of like the sort of changing like sort of testosterone fueled adolescent bodies that I was surrounded with in that kind of all male environment that I sort of grew up in through school. Like I was
That
just
must
like,
have been really
yeah,
scary
I was
for
just
you.
like, not only like might I actually have a sexuality, but it might also be like a kind of a weird, a deviant sexuality, and this wasn't something I ever kind of acted upon. Like I was just so uncomfortable with the idea of like sexuality, the idea of like ever kind of just exploring any of that was just like off the table for me.
Mm.
But I kept being drawn to these images, and eventually I kind of discovered this space where like just because and partly because I was so kind of afraid of social media at the time, where somebody had just taken to reposting very kind of innocuous images of like women who were like 6'6" or taller, just as kind of masturbatory material on DeviantArt. But like, I kind of eventually found this and started like clicking through a lot of the links as soon as I found them, and kind of discovered all these amazing people and these kind of amazing kind of stories of existing within kind of very um non-normative bodies, if you like it's kind of like even seeing someone who's like even seeing men who are kind of upwards of 6'6" is not like massively common.
Yeah, yeah, that's for sure.
So like to see you having to deal with that as a woman, having to sort of deal with like the additional pressure of being that much of an outlier in your sort of gendered space, and like coming through it with a real resilience as well, like really embracing their bodies and being really positive about their bodies. Like just eventually, like it kind of made me realize like that I was trans, basically, that I it wasn't like a sexual thing for me. It was just like I was just I just had gender euphoria looking at those bodies,
Mm-hmm.
and this all kind of gelled up with the idea that I had this fear of me kind of like bulking out and sort of growing muscly as sort of boys do, and all these different things, and like, but I mean, as I say, later on down the line, after I kind of went on sort of hormone replacement therapy, as I went on estrogen and particularly after I went on Decapeptyl, which is the drug that we use in the UK to sort of reduce testosterone levels
Okay.
within trans femme bodies. Um, I kind of eventually began to revisit the body of like particularly the supernatural giantess, um I come back to things like the old Cult B movie Attack of the 50-Foot Woman a lot. Like those sorts of kind of like sort of supernaturally scaled feminine bodies. And like kind of sort of well, it started off as a very ironic thing, me kind of like identifying myself as a giantess, but then I kind of started to realize that it was something that could actually be like a very sort of revolutionary act. And I kind of did realize that it was something that, like, the idea of being sort of like supernaturally powerful was something that was kind of very, like, that was actually kind of erotic to me. So, like, to come back to the idea of that kind of like beat versus do conundrum, like, the answer was kind of both. Like, it was kind of like I kind of wanted to be those bodies, but I also, like, quite a lot of, I found quite a lot of eroticism from actually kind of embodying those fantasies, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we kind of come back to me having no filter, because I've kind of just I like a lot of my work kind of like comes back to me like saying that like I have this kink. It's absolutely intrinsic to my understanding of my body, of my gender identity, of my
Yeah.
sexuality, and of my relationship with the world around me. And there is nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
And having that lack of filter and my ability to be able to say this and say this sort of confidently and say this proudly, even though like I know if I'd somehow become like a sort of noteworthy artist, like I am setting myself up for a lot of controversy by saying this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I feel like I feel like I have kind of a duty to explore these things, and also to actually kind of like take seriously like just the community. I've started doing a lot of exploring of like online and kind of sorry, real life sort of size kink communities, like people who like find kind of like you kind of do derive kind of eroticism from like um the idea of like sort of giants and sort of tinies, and like growth and shrinking and sort of like body like expansion and modification and everything,
Mm-hmm.
and just like really look into just the immense creativity, the immense imagination, and the just unbelievable humor and absurdity of those spaces and their awareness of that.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it's introduced me to so many just astonishing people as well doing that work, and people have really used like sort of kink and the erotic imagination to explore their relationships with completely tangential elements of their body. So, I mean, I'm not the only I'm not the only kind of like tall trans woman who's ever kind of like had to use sort of these very kind of like eroticized or fetishized kind of images of like sort of tall womanhood in order to sort of come out. I spoke to another trans woman who goes by the name of Miss Canada online, who had worked for who had like written like erotic size stories and worked as a kind of a kind of like size kink dom for several years
Mm-hmm.
before coming out as a trans woman. And kind of using that persona as a way of like exploring just womanhood and the ideas of kind of like, I guess, dominant womanhood as well. And I also spoke to another woman who like has several layers of pseudonyms online because of the fact that she works in a an educational nonprofit in Texas, which like you basically can't do if you're not just like perfectly like cisgender, heterosexual, vanilla, you know,
Right.
like any sort of like sexual gender deviance is like a big no-no in sort of like Republican controlled Texas.
Not in Texas.
But yeah, she spoke of having this neurological condition called Alice in Wonderland syndrome, which is a condition that means that basically people who have it can't consistently perceive the scale of objects or their own bodies. So, like, if like it's something that sort of comes in like episodes a little bit, you know, where they'll have moments where they kind of will genuinely feel like they're just like a couple of inches tall, or they might feel like they're the height of like an electrical pylon or a skyscraper or something, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Um, and for this person, like just exploring this erotically just became a way of her just really coming to terms with her condition and just embracing it, basically just being
Incredible.
able to be comfortable in her own skin.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I think had I not had like just the ability to come out and just sort of make this work just as someone who's very kind of out and proud about their gender identity, about their kind of neurodivergence, and about their kink,
Mm.
you know, like, I mean, like, a lot of this just wouldn't happen otherwise. Like, like, the world needs people without those filters a lot of the time, you know?
Yes.
And I mean, sometimes, like, I mean, it needs of them reason, you know. I mean, you sort of hope that somebody who's like not got a filter is sort of on the right side of the political
Of
spectrum, you
course,
know,
yeah,
or
yeah.
the correct side, I should say, and kind of just won't twist that into just something that could be like horrifically repressive, you know.
Yeah.
But like, I think that yeah, that's like
That's how you move forward, right?
yeah, I feel like just yeah, I feel like just having that combination of just imagination and that kind of just lack of filter, that ability to just say. And I'm going to come back to my cabaret performance yesterday, where like I did perform like something that is like a very kind of like I mean, it kind of like epitomizes the idea of this very kind of like radical socio-political like sort of kink fantasy.
Uh-huh.
Like it was a piece where I kind of like I had this persona who is named Nancy Archer. She's named after the monster from Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Um and I sort of performed this whole piece. It was a manifesto piece. It was kind of inspired by Solanas' Scum Manifesto, um, where I kind of like I talked the crowd through like this idea of like needing to just eradicate the kind of environmental and psychological remnants of things like heteropatriarchy, of capitalism, of hypermasculinity that we see kind of like etched into like I sort of create a lot of imagery surrounding like the like ideas of like the cold grey skyscraping canyons of capitalism that sort of line Manhattan, and the kind of like the fascist architecture of Washington DC as I kind of perceive it, like these sort of very dramatic like sort of towering domes and porticos and obelisks kind of arranged in this very kind of overwhelming way,
Mm-hmm.
and like the idea of like atomized suburbia as well as being this place where you just can't build proper community. You know, you can't build something that's kind of just queer and tender and just, just fluid in a space that's sort of designed for anything but that. And like
Mm-hmm.
the idea of just needing to destroy all of that before we can get on with building utopia, and then proceeded to sort of talk everyone through the benefits of just transforming themselves into like city-sized goddesses who can just like essentially grind Manhattan Island off the face of the earth,
Mm-hmm.
whilst sort of having like just being shot at by warships and nuclear weapons, and having that just be like this just sort of mesmeric, like sort of erotic sort of experience,
Uh-huh.
and like just yeah, so I
Hmm.
can't even remember what my point was here, but like I just yeah, I feel like I feel like the fact that I'm sort of able to do things like that as well, like in front of audiences and in front of like my A-level physics teacher was
Yes.
at the show last night, and I was sort of saying to them, I like probably pointed this out to the crowd that he'd walked in, and like I said that this is the man that like taught me about sort of like astronomy and the sort of like orbital motions of celestial bodies, and I'm like, I have probably dreamt about fucking a lot of those celestial bodies that you taught me about.
Uh-huh.
I'm like being very open about that, but like yeah, like it's
That's
it's kind
amazing.
of a wild perspective on just like sociopolitics and sort of relationships with the body and relationships with the environment, but like I do also attach myself to a lot of other people who don't have those necessary filters. I mean, I mentioned Catherine Gates earlier, who
Yeah.
was she wrote a book called Deviant Desires, which was a a massive resource for me, sort of exploring kink space. And she's also like a person with absolutely fuck all filter when it comes to these things. She was very open about the fact that she kind of wrote this book and started doing all this research into kink and like collecting this massive collection of like erotic zines from the 90s back during the kind of self-publishing boom of that era,
Mm-hmm.
just because like she was autistic and she wasn't kind of certain of like she was confused about her own sexuality and her relationship with her body, and thought that she just needed to find what turned her on, you know?
Yeah.
Which is not an uncommon experience for autistic people to go through. And I've found that by kind of talking to a lot of autistic and neurodivergent people, looking through like autistic forums online, for example. It's a very common thing that like particularly people that aren't particularly sexual, who may be somewhere on the asexual or aromantic spectrum,
Yeah. Yeah.
just end up just overcompensating and going hard into kink and fetish space just to try and find something that will turn them on and,
That
and
is
make them feel normal.
wow.
And like it's the same thing with Annie Sprinkle, who I also mentioned earlier, the post porn modernist herself.
Mm.
Like you think about the work that she's been doing with her partner Beth Stevens at the moment, where like they have this concept of ecosexuality, which is kind of similar to my own ideas of kind of like sort of sexuality and relationships with like the socio-political and environmental world, just without the kind of destructive elements that I kind of bring to it, which is all about kind of like embracing the earth and nature as a kind of as lover basically. And they do all these like amazing
Oh
kind of like
wow.
sort of
Yeah.
love and sex rituals involving like the natural environment and
Going back
everything,
to
and
nature.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
and like obviously we're talking about an artist there in Annie Sprinkle, who's probably most famous for like her piece Public Service Announcement, in which she like literally kind of got up on stage, like sort of opened herself up with the speculum and invited like patrons at her show
Oh,
to like
you told me about
look
that.
inside her. Yeah, literally sort of get like sort of I don't know what visual equipment they use, but literally just to take a look inside her sort of vagina and her cervix and everything, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Wow.
I think we need more of that in a way. Like I'm a very honest person. I don't I don't like to lie about myself. I don't like to conceal things about myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is also a lot of the environments I found myself in as an adult, and I think this is also kind of true of Wilton's as well, frankly. Like
Yeah.
the fact that I've been able to talk about a lot of these things with co-workers who haven't sort of found them sort of strange or off-putting really, or at least haven't told me that they have. Um,
It's
and
so
like
funny. It's
it's
nice.
just so yeah, I'm so thankful for that those kind
Yeah.
of spaces exist, and I think that
Great people.
more of the world should be like that. Like people should be willing to sort of cast off those kind of like pretentious filters, you know,
Yeah.
when it comes to just. But I guess people are so like attached to the idea of keeping up appearances,
Oh,
which is
yes.
not something that I don't suffer with. Like honestly, I
We
don't.
all
And I
do.
think a lot of my work at the moment is massively overcompensating for me, kind of like feeling this very kind of like I don't know British sense of like emotional repression, I
Mm,
guess.
that's,
Um,
yeah, I mean, we are kind of running a bit out of time.
yeah, I was expecting this was going to
But
happen.
I
I
mean,
do.
I want to just keep talking to you for the whole day, like do a day podcast because it's
Yeah.
so interesting. Maybe just before finishing, do you have any coming project for the future you want to share here? Or
So I mean, the piece I'm working on at the moment, which is going to be a very long term thing. Like I'm anticipating it taking about like 4 or 5 years to fully manifest. Is it's I'm currently writing what I consider to be like the ultimate adaptation of the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman story. Um, so as I said, took on like I sort of took on the name of Nancy Archer from Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, and I've kind of been reimagining her story as being a story where, like, because of the fact that she's like a very kind of just socially oppressed figure for her body and for her sort of relationship with gender and sexuality, she kind of decides to turn herself into the kind of giant monster, rather than kind of have it being done to her. Like in the kind of previous film adaptations of that story, you saw like in the original film from 1958, it was a male alien who sort of transformed Nancy into the 50-foot woman. In the 1993 remake, it was a series of female aliens who did it. And in my version of the story, I want it to be something that is a conscious choice made
powerful.
because of like the kind of oppression and injustice she sees from the world that she perceives, like aimed at her own body and perceived at sort of other sort of queer or sort of like gender non-normative bodies that she sees around her.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm currently writing a book, which is it's kind of called Nancy. It's called Nancy Unfucks the World, but
Okay.
like there is like halfway through the story, like she crosses out the and it just becomes Nancy
She
fucks the
fucks
world,
the
and like
world.
yeah, I'm planning on like because I want to self-publish the book. Like we're actually kind of recording this in my sort of printing space. Like I have my risograph printer just like over in the corner there,
Oh,
which I'm
yes.
going to use to print my book. And I'm going to have those two sides. That it's going to be sort of double covered. I'm going to have one side that says Nancy unfucks the world and one side that says Nancy fucks the world. But it's going to be like half it's fiction, half it's kind of telling the story of these two young women who were sort of like late teens, early 20s, who like sort of run away from school slash work, like take up sort of essentially squat in this flat in like suburban LA basically, and build up this community of other kind of like just oppressed, like sort of non-normative, sort of like women and queer and trans figures, and then basically just like transform themselves into kind of literal living goddesses who can actually bring about the change that they want to see in the world, who can actually kind of strip America of this very kind of like heavily kind of atomized heteropatriarchal kind of hyper-capitalist space
Mm.
and sort of like produce like their utopia in its place. And it's also going to be twinned with a lot of non-fiction text, like a lot of new non-fiction writing, like interview extracts, which I'm considering also doing this project as a practice-based PhD, like going forward as well.
Oh,
So it
okay.
might even turn into
Oh,
like an actual
great.
PhD thesis as
Well,
well. Um, but
exciting.
yeah, no, it's been going on for almost a year already.
Okay.
And yeah, I kind of want it done by 2028 because that year is the 70th anniversary of the release of the original United Artists Attack of the 50-Foot Woman and the 35th anniversary
Okay.
of the remake, which means we'll be as far from the remake as the remake will be from the original, which means we'll be overdue a new adaptation of this story.
So people
And
put
yeah, I
that in
kind
your
of wanted to
diary.
create the ultimate kind of like queer, like sort of gender fluid feminist version of this story.
Uh-huh.
That really turned Nancy Archer into a legitimate rebel.
Yeah.
Um, and still played with the idea of like there's a lot of like ideas of power dynamics and playing with the idea of like lack of autonomy in those original films that sort of women experienced throughout sort of like mid 20th century America.
Mm-hmm.
But like I really wanted to create something that just really got radical with that idea. And sort of like created a space where this kind of where this woman actively said wanted to say to herself like I am going to transform myself into this monster. I'm going to kind of martyr myself for the good of just all the queers, basically. All the kind of repressed queers and femmes and trans people, like the neurodivergent people of the world who just cannot sort of cannot be fit into the world as it currently exists or
Yeah.
cannot be very easily assimilated and just leave a world behind where that kind of like very tender, compassionate world where everyone's kind of free to be themselves,
Oh wow. That's
like
what you
can
want.
exist.
Yeah. Well,
So that's my current work, and it's
great.
going to be my current work for a long time going into the
Yeah.
future. And I'm also just to finish off, I am also going to be taking a lot of this work to the US next year. So
Mm-hmm.
I have been invited to like show off some work and also perform with the Coney Island Burlesque next year, and also at at SizeCon, which is like an actual like convention for sort of like size kinksters, a lot of whom I've sort of like sort of like done research interviews with, or like yeah, or obviously just like this work is kind of for them as well. Like it's also just like a massive effort of just dragging like sort of the idea of the erotic imagination in general, um and kind of like size kink in particular kind of out of the shadows a bit and just exposing it as this like just amazingly creative and hilarious and like potentially sort of revolutionary space that it could be.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So
great. I mean, I
yeah,
will put the links to like your Instagram and website and
yeah,
everything in the
yeah,
notes.
thank
But
you. But yeah,
thank
if,
you
if you
so
want me to shut
much.
up, I will finally shut up
Shut up.
now. Yeah,
But thank you so much, Abby.
that's
That was
okay.
really, really great. Well, ah.